Fusiform Rust. During the last 50 years, Fusiform Rust has received noticeable attention. This fungal disease was practically obsolete and barely recognizable 70 years ago. But when mass production of pines was implemented, Fusiform Rust started appearing in every stand. As a result, foresters and land managers were accused of increasing the intensity of this disease. Now, management strategies are being practiced to curtail the occurrence of Fusiform Rust on pines. Currently, this fungal disease is quite common on pines, especially those growing in intensively managed stands. Loblolly and slash pines are some of the most widely planted species in the southeast. Unfortunately, they're also the most susceptible to this disease. Pitch and longleaf pines are somewhat susceptible, while shortleaf pine is the least affected by Fusiform Rust. Although not generally a disease that causes mortality on a large scale, severely infected pines can succumb to Fusiform Rust. In most cases, however, the fungal disease drastically reduces the value of the timber. Even today, with all of the information from research and management activities, at least 30% of all loblolly and slash pines has this rust infection. The unique characteristic about Fusiform Rust is that this disease cannot affect pines without the presence of the alternate host, oak trees. An alternate host is necessary for the rust to complete its cycle of 5 distinct stages. The first identifiable spore stage occurs on the galls of infected pines. From February to March, yellow and orange blisters of powdery spores develop on these galls. By early April, these spores mature and are wind-blown to neighboring succulent leaves, usually the ones of water, willow, and laurel oaks. Fusiform Rust spores do not generally affect oaks in any way, but they will use this alternate host to survive and reproduce. During the next stage, the orange fungal spores develop and reproduce on the lower surface of these oak leaves. Next, the rust spores will continue to change their form on these infected leaves anytime from late April to June. The spores will become smaller and better prepared to infect susceptible pines. Now, the fungal wind-blown spores can infect succulent shoots and needles, a process that usually occurs in June. Once these spores infect pine tissue, they physically change again so that they can develop and reproduce. By late June, orange sticky spore dots are present on infected pine stems. As the spores continue to thrive on into December, the infected area of the pine will soon begin to swell, eventually creating a rust gall. These Fusiform Rust galls, or cankers, can exist on a pine's branches, the main stem, or both. Branch cankers are usually not as damaging as a main stem infection. If the branch gall is less than 12 inches from the bole, the infection can potentially extend into the main stem. A main stem infection causes more concern because it greatly reduces the value and vigor of the tree. If the main stem infection is severe, the canker can extend around the entire bole, girdling and eventually killing the tree. Usually seedling-sized and sapling-sized pines succumb to the disease by this progression. If the fungal attack occurs on a pine during the first 5 years, that tree will surely succumb to the rust infection. An older main stem infection on larger pines will display a depressed canker on one side. The pine tissue is usually dead in and around the canker, making that area on the tree very weak. This condition ultimately makes the pine tree vulnerable to wind and ice breakage. Treatment strategies for Fusiform Rust usually consist of preventive measures as well as control activities. Since aggressively managed pine stands are susceptible, reduce the intensity of site preparation. However, the management practice of site preparation should be implemented as needed for seedling survival and hardwood suppression. Enhanced pine growth is also known to increase the incidence of Fusiform Rust. So any activity that will drastically increase pine growth should be strategically analyzed. For instance, fertilizing a stand of pine seedlings should definitely not be considered. Delay this management practice until the seedlings are at least 8 years old. To decrease the potential of Fusiform Rust in a pine stand, the site can be regenerated with genetically rust-resistant seedlings. Nurseries will generally sell second and third generation pine seedlings that are quite resistant to this disease. Overall, the main objective for planting pines is to make sure that no seedlings or seeds in the stand are contaminated with fusiform rust. As impractical as it may be, susceptible oak species can be removed from the immediate area of the pine plantation. However, this preventive method seldom works since the rust spores can travel long distances by wind to their alternate host, and the actual labor is quite intense. In the unfortunate circumstance that several pines are infected with this fungus, there are some practices that will help eradicate the disease from the stand. If there are only a few trees in the stand with rust galls on the branches, prune the infected branches any time from July to January. These cut limbs should be burned or removed from the site to help reduce the presence of the fungus. If the stand has less than 25% of the pines with main stem rust cankers, the best recommendation is to periodically observe the stand. Implementing a control treatment may not be practical. The stand may be able to complete its rotation with limited losses. If the stand, however, has more than 50% of the pines with main stem rust cankers, a sanitation thinning or a clear-cut harvest should be considered. In executing a sanitation thinning, select the infected pines and harvest them from the stand. If this thinning results in an extremely low stocking, clear-cut the stand. The site should be replanted with a species that is less susceptible to fusiform rust, or with genetically rust-resistant pines. Practical for residential and commercial areas only, the application of a fungicide such as Balatin to infected pines works well in controlling the spread of rust fungus. A restricted-use fungicide, Balatin is often applied by a licensed pesticide applicator at nurseries to prevent infection of fusiform rust on pine seedlings.